You're talking about over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, over 8,000 Latin manuscripts. Most books that we work with in the ancient world have maybe at best a dozen manuscripts.
For some, the biggest barrier to faith is believing that Jesus Christ could really have risen from the dead. But Merrow says everything hangs on that.
Paul made the argument in 1 Corinthians 15, like, look, you can test this. If the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false. It's whether you believe it or not, whether you're sincere about it, if the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false, go to the next religion.
But Christian experts say that to dismiss the resurrection, any theory you come up with to explain the historical happenings has to explain 3 historical facts. That there was an empty tomb 3 days after Jesus' body had been placed in it. He appeared to hundreds of people in numerous places for almost 7 weeks after his crucifixion. And something huge happened to turn all the cowering, cowardly disciples into bold believers, proclaiming a risen Messiah they were willing to be tortured and die for.
Some suggest that the apostles all lied, a vast conspiracy theory to turn the deficit of his death into the positive of a risen Lord. But apologists like Darrell Bach here in Dallas point out that when you look at it all the way through, it's actually easier to believe in the resurrection than its alternatives.
Some suggest the female disciples who first found the empty tomb might have just had the wrong tomb. But surely the Jewish leaders who'd had Roman guards placed by Jesus' burial place and Joseph of Arimathea, who owned the tomb where Jesus was, would have quickly corrected that mistake.
If you're going around preaching Jesus was physically raised from the dead and people knew where he was buried and knew where they could find his bones, that message wouldn't even get off the ground.
A leading biblical apologist, Josh McDowell, says these disciples knew this.
In the resurrection, where was the hardest place in the world to convince anyone it was true if it was false? Jerusalem, where a 15-minute walk by anyone could confirm the emptiness of the tomb. And then they said, you were there, you saw it.
Matthew 28 points out the Jewish leaders bribed the tomb's guards to say that they'd fallen asleep and the disciples then stole Jesus' body. But if they were asleep, how would they know it was the disciples? And if the disciples were making up Jesus' resurrection, would they have lived and died for him and a fiction they themselves made up?
And if they knew it, then you'd have to say, here were these men who not only died for a lie, but they knew it was a lie. I challenge you to find others in the history that's true of. It's not.
You don't die knowingly for something that you know you made up. You would back off, and that didn't happen either.
These and other experts say that in truth, it takes something as radical as Jesus' resurrection to so completely transform cowardly Peter, who was so scared just before the crucifixion, he swore he didn't even know Jesus.
And then you see Peter with this radical transformation going from coward to this courageous champion who's saying, look, here I stand, this is what I'm saying, this is what's true.
Merrow points out Jesus' brother James was also instantly changed.
James, the brother of Jesus, didn't follow Jesus during his earthly ministry. He thought he was crazy.
James despised his brother, thought he was embarrassing the family, everything. And then Jesus appeared to him in James' own word, and he became the leader of the church of Jerusalem.
And then after the fact, James becomes an early leader in the church and was persecuted and eventually killed for that belief.
And apologists say it could only be a resurrected Jesus showing up 2 or 3 years later that could transform the church's worst persecutor into its main missionary.
Saul of Tarsus was anything but a follower of believing Jesus. He went from city to city, casting his vote to have him imprisoned and executed. But in his own words, Christ appeared to him.
So the main thing is just explaining, how someone like a Saul who becomes Paul even exists.
He was holding the coat when people were killing the first Christians. He was adamantly opposed to this movement, and then he became a Christian. What accounts for that?
The greatest murders into one of the greatest missionaries, to a Christian hater, to a Christian lover. Something happened in Paul's life that I've never found any other explanation that it even comes close to satisfying me intellectually except, and Jesus appeared to Paul after the resurrection.
The first century Jews believed women were second-class citizens. So if the disciples were lying about the resurrection, they made their story all the harder to accept by putting women at the forefront.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all recount Jesus' earliest women followers finding the empty tomb. Now that's never... That in the first century, where a woman's testimony would have been about the level of just above a slave, that would not be your best foot forward.
You never make up a story that way. This is what's called the criterion of embarrassment in historical Jesus studies, that you never make up the story this way. So the reason the story is this way is because it must be grounded in what happened.
Saying the disciples lied about Jesus' resurrection doesn't explain his appearance before 500 people. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 suggested doubters go talk to them.
You've got living history. You've got the people who were there to cross-check whatever message is being there. So it's not as though these things could have been invented and no one would have challenged it. You've got this idea that there's witnesses, go investigate them. It has all the ring of truth and not the ring of that conspiracy theory where they just made this thing up to invent their own religion.
A lot of people then say, well, the appearances of Jesus were hallucinations. 500 people one time.
McDowell studied the research on hallucinations, which shows they're not triggered by anything external, so no two people ever have the same hallucination.
Because it's all internal, subjective. Would it have 500 people have the same hallucination? Paul would be 500 miracles equal to the resurrection.
But Merrow does say to accept the resurrection, you do have to believe in God.
But if it's at least possible that God exists, then miracles become possible. And when you look at the resurrection evidence, it's pretty remarkable how strong it is. And that's why it's at the core of Christianity. But it's not a blind faith kind of thing like believing in the Easter Bunny or a lucky rabbit's foot. Christians don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible says so. They believe he rose from the dead because that's what the earliest and best historical documents show, and that's what's the best explanation of the data.
Paul Strand, CBN News.
Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is an excellent summary of what we believe. And what has been said before, you don't go out and die for a myth. If you create a false narrative, you're certainly not going to go out and die. You're not going to be crucified. You're not going to be burned at the stake.